They smiled on screen. They mended broken heirlooms, brought strangers to tears, and gave forgotten treasures a second life. But what no one knew, what no camera ever caught, was that Suzie and Steve Fletcher carried a secret. A quiet storm. Decades in the making, while the world admired their calm precision. Behind those barn doors was a silence so deep it nearly swallowed them whole. And now, that silence has broken. We're about to peel back layers that were never meant to be touched through childhood shadows. Unspoken trauma and a final decision that would change everything. This is not the story you thought you knew. For more than 10 years, millions tuned into the repair shop, drawn in by its slow, comforting rhythm. The gentle scrape of sandpaper, the faint tick of a restored clock. The shimmer in a family member's eyes as memories were returned in the form of repaired relics. At the center of this sanctuary stood two siblings, Suzie and Steve Fletcher, Suzie-graceful. Soft-spoken, with eyes that held stories she'd never told. Steve, methodical, composed, quietly grounding every moment with his calm. Together, they became something more than restorers. They were symbols of family, of love, of resilience. Their shared laughter. The way they intuitively understood one another. The subtle, almost unnoticeable glances they exchanged when emotions ran high. It felt real to real, like watching two souls perform a quiet duet. But harmony can be deceptive. Cause hidden behind that well-oiled dynamic was pain. Real, raw, and kept out of frame. While millions saw magic in their hands, what they didn't. See where the emotional calluses set by trauma, held together by silence. There were hints. A distant look in Suzie's eyes when a music box played a certain tune. A momentary pause in Steve's otherwise steady hands when a client spoke of loss. And those who watched closely began to wonder, what exactly were they repairing? What had been broken in them first? Beneath the surface, Suzie Fletcher wasn't always the composed artisan we saw on screen. Her poise was not inherited. She was raised not in studios or workshops, but against the rugged wild of Colorado ranchlands. A place that demanded grit, not grace. Her hands learned work early. So did her heart. Her first marriage was supposed to be her fresh start. Instead, it became a prison one without bars, but full of bruises. The man who once held her heart began to control it, and then crush it. She never told anyone, not for a long time, not her closest friends, not even Steve. But it changed her, turned her pain into patience, her heartbreak into healing. Every stitch she made, every piece she restored, was part of a quiet promise. I will not be broken. Steve Fletcher, meanwhile, worked in shadows of his own. The man whose hands fixed time itself was quietly trying to repair his own. His world was filled with gears, precision, and control. Everything his childhood had lacked. As a boy, Steve had no blueprint for calm. He was raised in a home that looked warm from the outside, but inside, it was coming apart at the seams. Their mother battled postnatal depression. Their father, overwhelmed, unraveling, eventually broke under the pressure. Steve watched. He learned, and he vowed, I'll hold everything together, even if it meant carrying more than he could bear. Their childhood home in Oxfordshire looked like something out of a sepia-toned. Memory wooden floors that creaked with every step, faded wallpaper that curled with time. And for children filling the air with laughter, footsteps, and the chaos. Of youth to outsiders, it was picture perfect. But behind that charming disarray was quiet devastation. Their mothers suffered silently from what no one then dared name: severe postnatal depression. Back then, there was no support, no understanding, no mercy. Her mind became a room she couldn't escape, and her silence filled the house. Their father, desperate to hold the pieces together, did his best until he simply couldn't. The pressure fractured him, a full, nervous breakdown. Tea was the family's anchor. And when he broke, they all drifted. There were days the Fletcher children were quietly sent away to relatives, neighbors, anyone who could shelter them, even for a moment. Not because they weren't loved, but because love, in that house, was tangled up in survival. Decades later, Steve would speak of it not with anger, but with aching honesty. "Our mom suffered dreadfully," he said in an interview, his voice heavy. "It wasn't just sadness. It was like she disappeared. And Dad, he couldn't take it anymore. He just cracked." Suzie added quietly, "Back then, the treatment they offered, it was cruel, barbaric even. No one knew what to do. She was trapped." Still, they remembered her not just as broken, but as human, flawed, overwhelmed, but loved. And somehow, through all that chaos, the siblings clung to each other. It wasn't just affectionate, was survival. In a house where even the walls had grown tired of carrying secrets. Steve and Suzie found their strength in one another, the years that disappeared in her early 30s. Suzie made a decision that shocked everyone. She left, she crossed the ocean, leaving behind Oxfordshire's familiar fog for the wide, lonely skies of Colorado. To most, it looked like an adventure, a fresh start. But for Suzie, it was something more primal. She wasn't running to something. She was running from something. There, across the Atlantic, she met Rob. He became her husband, and then he became someone else entirely to repair. Shop fans, Rob was a mystery. Rarely seen, never mentioned. A missing piece in Suzie's otherwise transparent story. What they didn't know is that her silence was not absence. It was protection. Their marriage was stained with hidden pain. She endured more than she ever admitted, even to herself. The smiling, gentle woman we saw on screen had learned long ago how to hide bruises beneath both fabric and silence. But Colorado also gave her something else: clarity, space to breathe, to think, to reclaim herself. And when she returned, older, wiser, and carrying invisible scars, she brought with her a quiet power no one could name. It was in every glance, every movement, a subtle strength forged in the darkest corners of love gone wrong. Back in Oxfordshire, Steve stayed grounded. He didn't leave. He didn't run. Instead, he built a life inside the very same world that once nearly broke him. He became a master of time, not just fixing clocks, but managing moments, emotions, memories. He raised 5 children. He cultivated a life of purpose. But through it all, he remained guarded, polished, private. The world saw his steady hands, his calm voice. But they didn't see the weight he carried, holding up not just a family business, but a family legacy. He and Suzie shared an unspoken agreement. Some things stay hidden because in their generation, silence wasn't weakness. It was protection. "We had to hide it," Suzie would later say. "Families didn't talk. Not then. It wasn't safe." Silence, for the Fletchers, wasn't just habit, was heritage. Every laugh captured on screen, every heartwarming moment in the workshop was framed by a choice to keep the real story hidden. The one that involved trauma, pain, survival. Steve, rooted in Oxfordshire, never once stepped into the spotlight beyond what the job required. He never left, never sought distraction in faraway places. Instead, he made peace with his past by learning to live with it like a clock that still ticks. Despite a cracked face, the cameras couldn't capture the cost of that quiet endurance. They never saw the nights where memories resurfaced uninvited, or the mornings where a smile had to be practiced before filming. And yet, Suzie and Steve kept showing up, not because they had to, but because healing, for them, looked like work. Every restored heirloom wasn't just a job, it was a metaphor, a broken piece of the past, lovingly made whole again. What they didn't say was often louder than what they did. In the subtle shift of Susie's voice when a guest mentioned home. In the way Steve's eyes lingered a second too long on a client describing loss. They never said it out loud. But viewers started to feel it. There was more to this story, a depth beneath a polished wood and leather. And piece by piece, that facade began to crack. Hairline fractures fans began noticing. Susie's unexpected absences from episodes raised. Quiet concern, the sparkle in her eyes once unwavering dimmed, as if something heavy had returned. Something she couldn't shake. Steve, too, began shifting. In interviews, his reflections deepened. The man who once spoke only of timepieces now hinted at the ticking within himself, memories locked away. Stories too heavy to tell in full. Snippets emerged. Podcast moments. Throwaway lines laced with weight. We weren't always okay. He admitted once, almost offhand, and suddenly, the warm and cozy atmosphere of the repair shop took on a different shade. Not darker, but realer. The audience, once comforted by their simplicity, now leaned in curious, empathetic, aching to understand what pain had shaped this incredible bond. What loss had taught them to hold each other so tightly? What secrets had they kept? And why now, after decades, were they beginning to share? It wasn't scandal that drew people in, it was truth, and soon the reveal came. Not all at once, but slowly, like the careful unwinding of a watch. Asterisk, asterisk, there was no press release, no TV exclusive. No tearful confessional splashed across tabloids. Instead, it came in the quiet way all meaningful truths do, softly, almost unintentionally. A podcast interview, Steve, usually reserved, spoke with unusual openness. His voice was steady, but something in it had shifted. There was no bitterness, no need for sympathetious reflection. When you grow up with that kind of background, he said, you just carry it. Quietly, but after a while, it begins to carry you. And then came Suzie. Still gentle, still graceful, but now deliberate. She echoed his sentiment, but added something even more powerful. You reach a point, she said, where silence becomes a burden, and the only way forward is honesty. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't performative, but it was profound because for decades they had built a career and a public persona composure on keeping things neat, orderly, fixed. Now they were admitting some things had never been repaired, and maybe never would be. But in that admission was something rare. Liberation, the quiet revolution, had begun. Not on camera, but in the spaces between. The chapter they never wanted to write for those who thought they'd finally heard it all. What came next shattered every remaining illusion in a longer, more intimate interview. Suzie opened a door she had kept bolted shut for most of her adult life. The story wasn't about heartbreak. It wasn't even about disappointment. It was about survival. She spoke for the first time about Rob, the man she married, the man she loved, and the man who almost ended her life. He had battled pancreatic cancer, a harrowing journey that exposed not just the fragility of the body, but the darkness that illness can awaken in a soul. At first, the signs were subtle. Mood swings, anger, isolation. But then came something she never imagined she'd experience: violence. He lifted me off the ground by my throat, she said, her voice a whisper. I couldn't breathe. My feet, they weren't touching the floor. I thought, this is it. I'm going to die. The room fell silent. Even the interviewer struggled for words. But Suzie didn't flinch. I never thought it would happen to me, she said. That kind of thing? It was for other women, other stories, not mine. He would never hurt me, ... until he did. She didn't share the story for pity. She shared it because silence had already cost her too much, because secrets rot in the dark. and because telling the truth was the first step toward reclaiming it. Asterisk, asterisk, for a long time. Millions watched as Suzie and Steve repaired time-worn treasures' leather-bound heirlooms. Family clocks, forgotten artifacts. But what those viewers never realized was that the real work wasn't on the table in front of them. It was behind their eyes, in their silence. In what they chose not to say. They weren't just fixing old items, they were fixing themselves. One stitch, one gear, one delicate polish at a time. Behind Suzie's calm hands and quiet smile lived a woman who had survived more than she had ever admitted even to herself. Behind Maurice, behind Steve's measured voice, lived a boy who had been forced to grow up too quickly. A man who took on the role of protector long before he was ready. They weren't just restorers. They were survivors. And their legacy wasn't about the antiques, it was about endurance, because every time they saved a family heirloom from decay, they were whispering a message whether they knew it or not. Even the most broken things can be made whole again. Bit by bit, they came back to life. Steve once said, in a rare, unscripted moment, "We didn't just fix things for other people. It helped us too." Piece by piece, we found ourselves again. It wasn't just metaphors, it was truth. Every tiny act of restoration gave them back control, a kind of spiritual agency that childhood trauma and adult suffering had tried to strip away. And Suzie, she found herself again through craft, through repetition, through focus, through connecting with the people who brought their memories to her and trusted her to hold them gently. "Every time I stitched a piece of leather," she said, "I wasn't just fixing a saddle. I was stitching something inside me. I was putting myself back together." That's the part the audience never saw, because for years they had to wear a mask, one shaped by professionalism, shaped by fear. But now that mask was gone, and what remained was stronger, more beautiful. Because it was real, their bond was the glue throughout all of this. Through broken homes, fractured marriages, long silences, and public scrutiny, Suzie and Steve never let go of each other. They shared more than blood. They shared an understanding. Only people who've seen the darkest corners of love and family can know. It was in the way they looked at each other. The way Steve would glance sideways when Suzie went quiet. The way she'd fill in his silences without needing to ask what was wrong. That bond became their anchor. And in a world obsessed with perfection, their quiet imperfections made them more loved than ever before. Asterisk, asterisk, for years, the world watched as Suzie and Steve brought relics of the past back to life. But now, in the wake of their long-hidden truth, something remarkable happened. People listened, not to the clocks, not to the ticking, but to the silence that had once surrounded the Fletcher siblings. Viewers began to see the story beneath the surface. To understand that the repair shop wasn't just about wood glue and wax polish, it was about grief, resilience, reinvention. It was about the things we carry and the courage it takes to finally put them down. For Suzie and Steve, breaking the silence wasn't about exposure. It was about freedom, because for decades, silence had been their armor. But in the end, truth became their liberation, the greatest restoration there. Legacy isn't a beautifully repaired clock or a perfectly stitched saddle. They showed the world that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's invisible, and sometimes it looks like two siblings sharing a cup of tea while repairing someone else's past, because it's the only way they know how to face their own. Their story isn't finished. It never will be, because trauma lingers. So does love. But the Fletchers have given us something we rarely see on screen: the full picture. Not just the finished product, but the cracks that led to it. And in doing so, they've restored something far greater than antiques. They've restored hope. A final question for you. Maybe you're watching this from a quiet room. Maybe you're carrying something you've never told anyone. Maybe your smile, like theirs, hides something no one can see. So ask yourself, what's one truth you've kept hidden for too long? And what would it take to finally let it out? Leave your thoughts in the comments, not for us, but for you. Because like Suzie and Steve, maybe it's time to stop hiding. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.